Welcome to Becoming Jewish, the sculptor Benno Elkan. Today we have 3 speakers. After their presentations, there will be time for Q&A, so please submit your questions. This is an event of our monthly series Flight or Fight, Stories of Artists Under Oppression, which is generously sponsored by Allianz Partners. I'm Rachel Stern, Director and CEO of the Fritz Ascher Society for Persecuted, Ostracized and Banned Art based in New York. We research, discuss, publish and exhibit artists whose life and work were affected by the German Nazi regime between 1933 and 1945. First of all, I thank Hans Menzel-Severing for his lifelong research about Benno Elkan, which is the basis for all we know today about the artist. It is my pleasure to now introduce our first speaker, Christian Walda from Dortmund, Germany. After training as a bookseller, Christian Walda studied art history, philosophy, and political science at the University and the College for Jewish Studies in Heidelberg and at the University of Siena, Italy. His research focuses on the philosophy of art, theory of corporeality, political art, and forms of aesthetic memory work. In 2007, he completed his studies with a doctorate on the Austrian sculptor Fritz Ascher. Christian Walda has curated and organized more than 30 exhibitions with a focus on contemporary art. A large exhibition with works by the German painter and sculptor Rainer Fetting is currently on view in the Dortmunder U. 2008 to 2014, he was the head of the Jewish Museum Rendsburg, and 2015 to 2018, head of the painting collection of the State Museum for Art and Cultural History in the Schleswig-Holstein State Museums Foundation at Gottorf Castle. Since 2019, he is the head of collections and since 2021, also deputy director of the Museum for Art and Cultural History, Dortmund. Welcome, Christian Walda.
Yeah, Rachel, thank you very much for your introduction, and thank you very much for your invitation and the great opportunity to talk about the German and the Jewish sculptor Benno Elkan. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you very warmly. First of all, I would like to apologize for some of the illustrations that we will see in a moment. Some works and historical photos are not well published in terms of quality. The most important source for Elkan, you said it, for his life and his artistic work is still Hans Menzel-Severing's research. He would certainly be able to give a better introduction than I can. The next, please. In these 20 minutes, I will first tell you something about the life and then about the art of Benno Elkan. In Elkan's case, life and work have a mutual influence on each other. This is not the case with every artist. The next, please. Elkan was born in Dortmund on December the 2nd, 1877. He thus belonged to a very strong generation of artists in Germany. His mother's name was Rosalie née Oppenheimer. His father was named Solomon, and he was a tailor. Here in the picture, the next slide, please. No, the previous, sorry. Yes, the previous, please. Here you see the father on the left and the mother on the right side. The father and the partner ran a men's clothing store in downtown Dortmund. The family was part of the Jewish community and was firmly integrated into the civil society. As an important chess pioneer, his father was co-founder and president of the Dortmund Chess Club, founded in 1875. Benno Elkan was also practicing Jew, but we can assume that the patriotic character as a German was certainly stronger in his early days. Elkan was an avid soccer player. He co-founded the first Dortmund soccer club, the FC 95, of course, in the year 1895. Later in Munich in 1900, he was one of the co-founders of what is now the most successful soccer club in Germany, with the largest number of members worldwide, the first FC Bayern Munich. The next, please. Elkan completed a vocational training and worked as a seller of umbrellas in Antwerp, Belgium. But he longed to be an artist. In 1898, he went to the Munich Academy, the outstanding artistic school at the time. However, he did not learn sculpture, but attended Johann Heterich's painting class. 3 years later, Elkan moved to the academy in Karlsruhe and continued to learn the art of painting, now under the supervision of Friedrich Fehr. During this time, he also got to know the important painter Wilhelm Trübner. Here in Karlsruhe, he decided to become a sculptor. He learned this art through self-study. The next, please. In Karlsruhe, he also met his future wife. The pianist Hedwig Einstein was the sister of the theorist Karl Einstein, art theorist Karl Einstein, and the daughter of a rabbi. They married in 1907. The brother-in-law Einstein is best known for his promotion of Expressionism in Germany. Elkan lived in Paris from 1905 to 8. Numerous acquaintances are known from this period, including the most important sculptor and pioneer of modernism at the time, Auguste Rodin. He was on the scene of the famous Café du Dôme. The well-known German painters Rudolf Levi and Max Porheim belonged to his inner circle. Elkan lived in Rome from 1908 to 11, and during this time he was intensely preoccupied with Renaissance art and antiquity. His daughter Ursula was born here, and their son Wolf followed a few years later. Elkan should make a living from his art. In 1911, the family built a house in Alsbach in Hesse, south of Darmstadt. When the First World War broke out, Elkan was drafted, and after suffering from cholera, he was used for the postal service in Frankfurt. This is probably how the family lived in Frankfurt from 1919 until they immigrated. Here in Frankfurt, Elkan was heavily involved in the art scene, and he was able to build up a large network. He was a member of the so-called Artists' Council, which advised the city on commissions. In 1920, he was able to erect an anti-war memorial, and during his many trips, this time Elkan revisited Dortmund numerous times. Close contacts to the art patron Osthaus, for example, should support his success. As early as 1933, Elkan was actively preparing for his move to London. The immigration probably followed in 1934. In 1935, he was banned from working and exhibiting in Germany. And however, in London, he had a solo exhibition in the Knödler Gallery in 1936. In Great Britain, Elkan had great success and recognition. So in 1957, he was awarded to the title of the Officer of the Order of the British Empire. His wife died in 1959, and Benno followed her in 1960. The next slide, please. Let's move on to the artistic work of Benno Elkan. With a few exceptions, Elkan's work can be distinguished in 5 ways, which I would now like to show with a few examples. Funeral sculptures, portrait busts, medals, candelabras, and monuments. The next slide, please. Elkan received the first commission for a grave sculpture in his academic years. The first execution was in 1904. The second commission, completed in 1905, can be seen here. The Resurrection. It is a bronze sculpture as a relief. Reliefs were Elkan's preferred form of burial sculpture, which are always more or less high reliefs. Both are located in the cemetery Ostfriedhof in Dortmund. The work Resurrection is an almost wonderful balanced composition of a block of people, perfectly fitted into the rectangle. The figures have different mimics, and the postures correspond to the very emotional art expression which is shaped by the Art Nouveau. The next, please. In the same year, the Christ's head was created, also for a tomb in this cemetery. The expressiveness is not only suffering, but strangely calm and superior, despite all the expressiveness. The next, please. The figure Persephone, you can see the works are becoming more and more sculptural and three-dimensional, is a direct effect of Elkan's occupation with antiquity during his stay in Italy. On the right, you can see a rare sculpture created by removal of material, not by adding it, with a flute player. The next, please. Here again, later relief. All these grave sculptures were created exclusively by commissions. The next, please. The medals, like the grave sculptures, are mostly from Elkan's early creative days. There are a total of 150 different motifs of them. The portraited persons were not only art patrons and artists, such as Heinrich Kirchhoff and Gustav Mahler, the next please, but also people from Elkan's circle of friends and politicians. Elkan created the first medals in the Parisian period. It is thus that French prime ministers such as Georges Clemenceau and Maurice Robier are also among those depicted. The medals are not all orders. It was not uncommon for Elkan to create medals without commission for the free market. The next, please. The second art form of the portraits are busts. Among them are sometimes very well-known and powerful personalities. They include artists such as Karl Valentin and Yehudi Menuhin, the next please, or politicians such as Walter Rathenau, the foreign minister in Germany, Winston Churchill, and the King of Siam. Here is a 10-year-old boy. The next, please. And very nice at the end, a portrait of a monkey family, a group of orangutans, now to be seen at the Edinburgh Zoo. The next, please. The fourth art form in Elkan's work is very special, and I can be brief because Ori will, after me, go into more detail about the great candelabra in Jerusalem. Since about 1921, Elkan has been working for the first time on a Jewish religious object, a multi-figure candelabra with stories from the Tanakh, here in the picture on the left. This turn to his own tradition is interesting because Elkan had not received a commission for this piece of art, but may be regarded as free work. When he immigrated from Germany, Elkan took this candelabra to England, where it became part of Westminster Abbey. It tells narratives of the Jewish religion. Adam and Eve, as the crown of creation, form the upper end of the candelabra. 3 years later, the installation in the church, Elkan was commissioned with a second candelabra, which was juxtaposed with the older one in Westminster Abbey, the New Testament. You can see it on the right side. The next, please. However, Elkan received his first order for candelabras in Germany, namely in 1927 for the synagogue in Bruchsal in the south of Germany. He created a grille for the lectern and 2 candelabras. After his immigration, Elkan created a candelabra for the King's College Chapel in Cambridge, and in 1934, one for the New College Chapel in Oxford in 1938. The next, please. The climax at the end of his life was the great Menorah. More on this by Mr. Soltes. The next, please. Elkan's last art form are memorials. They are not remembrances of individual personalities, but of events. All 3 realized monuments are made of granite and have a block-like approach. All consist of a female as a mediator of an abstract meaning. The first monument was created as a figure in 1913-14, before the beginning of the World War I. This sculpture was erected in 1920 as a memorial to the victims of the war in Frankfurt. The work is a profound expression of Elkan's hatred of war in general and reflects his premonition of the rising battle of nations in Europe. The next, please. In 1924, the memorial to all victims was inaugurated in Völklingen near Saarbrücken. For this, Elkan has designed a kneeling mourner as a symbol. It is about the victims of all nations in a war. So, no surprise, chauvinists began attacking the memorial in 1924. This memorial for peace was destroyed during the Nazi era in 1935. The next, please. The third work of this kind is Elkan's monument to the liberation of the Rhineland, inaugurated in 1930. The importance was obviously so highly appreciated that the German president came to attend it. This monument has also been destroyed. The next, please. Finally, the memorial to the defenseless victims of the bomb war, which Wolfgang will explain afterwards, has never been carried out in this form. Finally, the next, please. Finally, I would like to say a little about the style of Benno Elkan's art and about the question of his Jewishness on style, which always include the question of the meaning content, not only the form. The works of Elkan are at first very disparate. As an example, I pick out two sculptures: the female figure dedicated to the victims, 1913-14, and his sculpture of a beggar. The first sculpture is a truly block-like figure which does not deny the stone weight. Elkan corresponds here entirely to the expressionist sense of form, and it strongly reminds of figures by Käthe Kollwitz and Ernst Barlach. The next, please. In his early creative life, Elkan lived in Paris, where the influence of Auguste Rodin was strong. If you look at the old beggar from 1909 here in the picture, you can also see the taste of the time. The next, please. And for me, it's weird. These two sculptures were created by the same artists. And the next, please. The Renaissance art was very important. If you look at the reliefs of Lorenzo Ghiberti, seen by Elkan in Florence, you understand the form of narratives of the great Menorah. Both are like a comic strip in the narration. The next, please. The art of Elkan, I would say, stylistically as well as in terms of expressiveness, is first very disparate. That doesn't have to be a bad thing at all. I actually find this very interesting. You can see that even the elder artist never stopped experimenting. Second, the main motive of Elkan is remembrance. Whether grave sculptures, portraits and medals, or busts, even the candelabras and the monuments, we always have to deal with memory in Elkan's work. I think it's a real pity that he has only planned 4 monuments. One of them has never been carried out and 2 have been destroyed. There was still a lot of potential left, I think. Thirdly, humanism and the search for peace is so obvious. I maintain that the most important source for this comes from the Jewish tradition. The next, please. That brings us to the question of Elkan's Jewishness. Has Elkan become more Jewish over time? I would say yes. Like many people who were persecuted as Jews during the Nazi era, Elkan was turned more to his origins and a religion in old age. In this case, he is in very good company. Even materialistic philosophers like Hannah Arendt were no different. And I would say no at the same time. For Elkan, Judaism had never disappeared. It worked and has always present. Elkan sought peace from the Jewish tradition. A sentence from the Tanakh, book Zechariah, in which the appearance of Candelabra is told, can be found on the great Menorah. I quote, "Not by army and not by violence, but by my spirit, says Yahweh Sebaot." My conclusion is Elkan's artistic will and motive is the search for humanity in general. Elkan himself defines his view in his unpublished writings in contrast to the Renaissance artist Raphael. He considers Raphael's paintings in Rome to be of uninteresting, smooth perfection. His art lacks, I quote again, the inadequacy and passion from which the human heart is captivated. Yes, the human being is the center of the art of Benno Elkan. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Christian Walda. We now have the fortune to hear in-depth discussions of Elkan's two most important works. For the first time, the memorial to the defenseless victims of the bombing war is presented here to the international public, followed by a discussion of Elkan's Menorah in Jerusalem. It is my pleasure to welcome Wolfgang Weick from Dortmund to speak about Elkan's memorial to the defenseless victims of the bombing war. Wolfgang Weick studied history, English, political sciences, and contemporary history at the University in Mannheim and the University of Waterloo in Canada. 1979 to 1986, he worked as researcher and curator at Berliner Festspiele GmbH and Senate Department of Culture in Berlin. In 1986 to 87, he was the head of the development team and deputy director at the House of the History of the Federal Republic of Germany in Bonn. From 1988 until 2014, he was the director of the Museum for Art and Cultural History in Dortmund, and from 1995, also division manager of the municipal museums in Dortmund. Welcome, Wolfgang Weick.
Yes, hello. For me, it's a great honor and of course a great pleasure being invited today to give you a short lecture on Benno Elkan's memorial for the victims of the bombing war in 2 chapters. And chapter 1 is called "Why the Memorial Has Never Been Erected During Elkan's Lifetime."
Yeah, I'm just trying to pull it up. There we go.
Yeah.
Okay.
Play from start, slideshow. Yeah. In December of 1947, 2.5 years after World War II had ended and 1 year after he and his wife had finally become British citizens, Benno Elkan turned 70. This is an age when most people eventually go into retirement. Not Benno Elkan though. He still has his life's work, sein Lebenswerk, as he calls it, in front of him. 2 subjects are moving him at that time. One is the fate of the Jewish people in Palestine. The other, the millions of victims of the bombing raids during the war. In a memorandum in which he presents his idea to create a large 7-branched candelabra dedicated to the history of the Jewish people, he begins his work on the Great Menorah. The first sketches of a monument he originally called "To the Memory of the Millions of Helpless and Defenseless Victims of the Bombing War, 1939 to 1945, might have even been done earlier. Quote, "The idea came to me during the war, when we, just like you over in Germany, were seeking protection from the bombs. What I want with this memorial, which shall not glorify any specific ideology and not set one nation against the other, is to help re-erecting the injured dignity of man." End of quote. Elkan later writes to a friend in Dortmund. Next one. In 1946, the city administration of his second hometown, Frankfurt am Main, where he had been living from 1919 until his emigration in 1934, and where he had had a profound impact on local cultural life, set up again his monument, Den Opfern, to the victims of World War I, which had been cleared away by the Nazi regime in 1933. Next one. Yes, we have seen that before. Next one. In April of 1953, Elkan's idea of a new memorial for the victims of World War II is introduced in Frankfurt by a group of old friends. In a memorandum, he explains his intentions, quote, "These unarmed, helpless, and defenseless victims who perished in the towns, still surrendered by the marks of their dreadful death in supposed shelters, they are nowhere remembered in sympathy. So much was I affected by the consciousness of this immense suffering, which the expected death nearing with horror and terror roused in defenseless and unarmed people, that I thought I should create a monument which represents the suffering of all these people, young and old, women, girls, mothers with their children, men of all ages, trades, and professions. In short, a picture of mankind in such inhuman situation where all sorts of characters show up next to each other." End of quote. In July 1954, Elkan is given the chance to personally present his model in Frankfurt. A lively public debate follows in the newspapers, in articles and letters to the editor, which in turn gives us a very interesting insight into dispositions and mentalities of an urban society, not even 10 years after the end of the war. The arguments can be summed up in the critical verdict of two experts who were asked for a report by the city government: Ernst Holzinger, the director of the Städel Museum, and Hans Mettel, a sculptor, and the director of the Städel School. Quote, "Certainly, this memorial is an accusation, but most people will understand it as an accusation against Germany's enemies during the war, and not as an accusation against themselves. Yet exactly this should be important, considering their own guilt." End of quote. Thus, the decision of the Municipal Committee on Science, Art, and Education refusing to buy the memorial comes as no surprise. After the installation of the Great Menorah in Jerusalem in 1956, hardly anything new is created in Elkan's studio in London. He adds some corrections to the clay model of his memorial from time to time, but the aggravation of his illness does not allow for anything else. In the fall of 1958, Elkan is staying in the health resort of Königstein in Taunus in Germany, marked by his illness, where he meets his old acquaintance Erich Leue from Dortmund. To him, he now submits his heart's desire: the memorial should be erected in his hometown in Dortmund. In his own words, quote, "Towards the end of a full and successful artistic life, I would like to select my hometown Dortmund as the place where the monument should be erected, because I love no city more than this one in which I grew up, because at the beginning of my 8th decade, so many memories are vividly and intimately linked with this city." End of quote. But Leue, who supports this idea, is not in good health either, such that he is not able to realize a planned visit to London, nor to further promote Elkan's wish in Dortmund. Next one. Next one, please. Yet the main reason why Elkan's offer had no chance in Dortmund at that time was that the city itself had since the mid-50s been planning and eventually building a memorial for the so-called Good Friday murders of 1945, when just 2 days prior to the arrival of American troops in Dortmund, a killing squad of the Gestapo had executed around 300 prisoners of war forced laborers, and resistance fighters from all over Europe in Dortmund's Rumberg Park. This monument, created by the local artist Karel Niestrat, was finally dedicated on Good Friday of 1960 in Bittermark in Dortmund. On May 11th, 1959, Elkan writes his last letter to Dortmund. On October 1st, his wife Hedwig dies, and he is moved to a nursing home. And on January 9th, 1960, he dies there a month after his 82nd birthday. The model is stored in a London warehouse, and a few years later, there is no trace of the model. All that remains are 9 black and white photos. Let's have this picture. Next one, please. Yes. Now, chapter 2. Why the world? No. Just stay on this previous one. That's exactly what I want to see. What I want to show. Chapter 2 now. Why the world can see the memorial 50 years after Elkan's death now. Well, this second chapter will not be a scholarly lecture, but more of a personal story based on experience, because since I was one of the protagonists of the following events. It all started in September of 2010, when the state government of North Rhine-Westphalia announced a statewide festival, Days of Jewish Culture, to take place in spring of 2011. Dortmund's contribution to this festival was to be an exhibition of the works of Benno Elkan that had been purchased 50 years ago at the auction of his estate by Christie's in London after his death. It is true to say that this exhibition in the Museum of Art and Cultural History, my former museum, from March to May 2011, was the starting point for a new interest in Elkan's life and work, not only for me, but for a few others in Dortmund too, mainly for 3 reasons. Next one, please. Thanks to our research at the archive of the Academy of Arts in Berlin, we found new insights. Above all, that Elkan thought of himself as a soccer pioneer in Dortmund. And indeed, as we found out, and Christian just mentioned it too, indeed he had been one of the founders of the first soccer club in Dortmund in 1895, as we now know. And what is more, 5 years later, in 1900, while he was studying and painting at the Royal Bavaria Academy of Arts in Munich, he was one of a group of 16 young men who founded the nowadays very famous soccer club Bayern München. For a soccer-crazy city like Dortmund, this was news. Who has ever heard of a renowned artist who had been playing soccer and helped found 2 soccer clubs as a young man? Second, I got in contact with Beryl Hemmel, Elkan's granddaughter, living in San Francisco. Thanks to her donating his personal papers to the archive in Berlin in 2010, we were able to dig deeper into his life than ever before. And yes, her own newly awakened interest in her grandfather's life and work was truly contagious. Next, please. Further down the road, Gerd Kolbe, a former head of the press and information department of the city of Dortmund and a friend of mine, also became very interested in Elkan's story. As a longtime organizer of a rather important annual international chess tournament in Dortmund, he found out that Salomon Elkan, Benno's father, was the founder of the first chess club in town in 1875, acting as president and later on as honorary president for decades. So we both promised each other to keep on looking for more insights and not relent until the story of the Elkan family would find its due place in the history of Dortmund. Next one. Thanks to the initiative of another friend, Friedrich Fuß, the district mayor of Dortmund West, our next chance came in April of 2016, the dedication of a new street in the neighborhood of Dortmund's new Center of Arts and Creativity, the Benno Elkan Allee. Next one. We were able to orchestrate quite an event and arranged an invitation for Mrs. Hemmel to the ceremony. On that evening, we gave her the opportunity that she had asked for to make a presentation of what she called Benno's dream at a dinner attended by the mayor, the district mayor, the president of the Historical Society, the director of the municipal bank, and other VIPs of the city. without knowing the history of the war memorial that I just outlined, which to be honest, we ourselves were not aware of in detail at that time, Beryl Hemmel suggested in a perfectly set presentation nothing less than to finally fulfill her grandfather's heart's desire, to reconstruct and erect the monument in his hometown. With the blessing of Mayor Ulrich Zero, Weick and Kolbe and I set out to do what? It is true to say that we really did not know ourselves where the road would take us once we got started in our networking in the summer of 2016. 1.5 years later, in December of 2017, on the day Benno Elkan had been born 140 years ago, the mayor was able to announce that we had found a way, not only to reconstruct Benno Elkan's war memorial on the basis of 9 old photos, but also to present it in 3D. It was a joint venture that we were able to put together of the IT specialists of Viality, an IT startup from the technology park in Dortmund with its CEO Markus Rall, and the scientists and researchers of the Institute for Graphic Systems at the Technical University of Dortmund with Professor Heinrich Müller in the chair. The next one. Up until then, the teams had put in a lot of work hours as volunteers. An analysis of the surviving photos had brought surprising insights. Obviously, they had not been taken from all perspectives, nor by the same camera, nor at the same point in time, since details of the models had changed. The artist must have been working on it in the meantime. It became clear that any automatic reconstruction would be impossible due to the minor quality of the photos. And even a semi-automatic reconstruction seemed only feasible if new software tools could be developed. But the teams were optimistic that a reconstruction could be done. The idea came up with then, they came up with then was to present the reconstructed monument in 3D with the methods of augmented reality and the help of a specific lens. Next one. After a legal frame for the project was provided by the Historical Society of Dortmund and funding by the Sparkasse, the municipal bank, the teams were able to start with the real work, creating and putting together the data needed to get the envisioned result. Step by step, next one, partly with the help of body scanners and partly by creative programming by so-called gamers, experts that normally create the characters of computer games, the various figures and groups were formed and finally put together in front of the shattered wall and the rubble. 9 months later, in August of 2018, the major goal was achieved. Mayor Ulrich Zero was able to present the reconstructed memorial for the victims of war in augmented reality to the public. Next one, quote. One of the reasons why we today, 60 years later, are wanting to fulfill Benno Elkan's dream is that it is our wish to keep on remembering him, his family, his work, and his humanitarian attitude, and therefore also remember the loss that we in Dortmund had to suffer due to the crimes of the Nazi regime. His memorial was meant to commemorate all victims of the bombing terror of World War II. And we now, after 60 years, want to include all the people who fell victim to bombing raids since, with the Syrian cities as last victims in mind. End of quote. Next one. The project was finalized in January of 2020, exactly 60 years after Elkan's death, with the installation of 2 QR code markers, one in the entrance hall of the Museum of Art and Cultural History, and one in the urban space at the foot of the Benno Elkan Allee next to the U-Tower in Dortmund. The next one, please. There is the virtual outdoor version, 3 times as big as indoors, just as the artist has envisioned, and can be seen with the help of an app in one's own mobile device. Next one. And the next one. In the museum, everyone can view the virtual monument in 3D in its small version. The artist had meant for an indoor presentation with a specific lens and also in one's own mobile device. What is more, next one, if you download the app and print out the marker, both of which you find on the website Benno Elkan, Benno-Elkan.de, you can view the memorial in your living room. Next one. Here's the QR code. Here is the website. And I thank you for your attention.
Rachel, you're muted.
Okay, thank you so much, Wolfgang Weick. This is such an exciting project, and I'm glad that you shared it with us. It is now my pleasure to introduce Ori Z Soltes from Washington, D.C. to speak about Elkan's Menorah in Jerusalem. Ori Z Soltes teaches at Georgetown University across the disciplines of theology, art history, philosophy, and politics. Since 1997, he is a founding director of the Holocaust Art Restitution Project, a former director of the Bnei Brit Klutznik National Jewish Museum in Washington, D.C. He has extensive experience in developing and executing exhibition concepts. He's the author of or editor of 25 books, including The Ashen Rainbow, The Holocaust and the Arts, Symbols of Faith, How Christian, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim art draw from the same source, and Tradition and Transformation, 3 millennia of Jewish art and architecture. Welcome, Ori.
Thank you so much. It is both a pleasure and a challenge to be following the presentations by Christian and Wolfgang, but I like the scope of how things are ending up. And if one ends up with Belkan's 7-branched candelabrum, the menorah in front of the Knesset building in Jerusalem, then one has to start with the 7-branched candelabrum idea within Jewish art proper. And the first instance, in a sense, one has of that of some significance is, I'm showing you a detail here, of the high relief sculpture of the temple menorah from Jerusalem. It's 7 branches resting on a stem that has fronds and then on a base that has zodiac motifs that are part of it. It's on the underside of the Arch of Titus. The arch was built by Titus's younger brother after Titus's death, so in the early 80s CE, to commemorate Titus's great accomplishment of bringing to an end the Judean revolt against Roman power that led, by a matter of collateral damage, really, to the destruction of the temple. And then as Titus was welcomed back to Rome in victory, the procession included the procession of this major object within the temple, brought back to Rome, and who knows whether it's in the bowels today of the Vatican or just doesn't exist any longer. There are always those kind of stories and suppositions about where it might be. But the point is, ironically enough, because this is a depiction by the Romans after their conquest of Jerusalem and of Judea, it becomes the preeminent Jewish symbol over the course of the centuries, not just because it was the 7-branched menorah in the temple, but because in its 7ness, it relates to the whole idea of the covenant with God, the promises and responsibilities that are, in a sense, contained within that commandment that tells the Israelites to keep the 7th day sacred, given as they're leaving Egypt at Sinai, heading to the promised land, going from servitude to freedom, and so on and so forth. So it has all these connotations. And so we see it again and again and again in all kinds of media. This is from the late 1st century. It's a detail from a capital, from a column, what's left of a synagogue in Caesarea. We see it on mosaic floors of late ancient, early medieval synagogues, such as this at Bet Sha'an in the 5th, 6th century, where in fact we have 2 menorot, perhaps representing the 1st and the 2nd temples, or perhaps representing the temple of the past and the hoped for messianic temple of the future. One sees it if we fast forward all the way to the 18th century on a parochet, a Torah ark curtain from South Germany that dates from 1772. And one can even see it in a much more oblique kind of manner in this wonderful painting. It's one of 4 or 5 landscapes that Modigliani did, done in 1917. And this is not the place to get into the details, but you can see that the tree that he has contrived here is kind of a menorah tree. The center part rising from the window to the peak of the building behind it. And even the 2 branches that have foliage, they look like candles. So there is, or candlelight. So there's a long history of the 7-branched candelabrum. And obviously, as was pointed out by Christian, all the way back in 1920 through 31, he was working on this project while still in Germany of a very Art Nouveau-like, Jugendstil-like, floral-like menorah, a kind of tree of life in the traditional Hebrew biblical sense, with Adam and Eve at the beginning, and then a whole series of other figures centering around Moses. And that he brought with him when he fled Germany in 1933, and it ended up 6 years later installed at Westminster Abbey. How more appropriate for a refugee coming to London than to have a work at that most iconic of English institutions. And on top of that, he's asked to do a second one, which he does. It's installed 3 years later, which reflects on the New Testament. So Old Testament, New Testament, variations on the theme of this. And they are candelabra. You can see they're little holders, right? Places for candles, but the candelabrum as a kind of tree of life. So as both my predecessors in this forum have pointed out, it's not as if he suddenly discovered his Jewish identity, but it certainly became more expansive as he worked emotionally and psychologically through the time of the Second World War, the Holocaust, and the destruction of so many things Jewish, and the revival and revitalization of Jewish life in the new old land of Palestine becoming Israel by 1947, 8, 9. And lo and behold, on what becomes the state seal, you can see that the new state has taken almost exactly the menorah as it was depicted on the Arch of Titus, but also the word Yisrael below it. It has flanked it by a pair of olive branches, which is a reference to a passage in the book of Zechariah, chapter 4, where the vision he has of a heavenward lamp is flanked by 2 olive trees. So this too is kind of feeding into what Elkan is thinking about, no doubt, when he begins the creation of this magnificent structure. You saw in one of the images him standing working on it. So he was down here, so you get the sense of its size. It is about 14 feet high by 12 feet wide, 4.3 meters to be precise in its height, and so on. And overrun with 40 different high relief sculptures. As Christian pointed out, everything he seemed to do in relief, he seemed to prefer high relief. Even the medallions are relatively high relief compared to how one often finds them. And with inscriptions along the 6 arms, in fact, coming from Zechariah. And it was quoted by Christian, "Not by might nor by power, but by my spirit, says the Lord." And that's the context in which that vision of the lamp with the pair of olive trees is presented in that prophetic book. And I should point out, by the way, that his intention and expectation, and I think of this because of Wolfgang's discussion of the presentation of his war memorial inside as well as outside, and how you could see it from above on the inside, so to say, in that image he showed. His intention was for this to be actually in an inside space lit from above. So he constructed it with the idea that you'd be kind of looking up at these figures and they would be lit from above, obviously very dramatically. And as obviously a number of his hopes and ambitions, it wasn't fulfilled. It's outside, but of course in an appropriate place. And the narrative, in a sense, goes from top to bottom, but in a sense, it goes top, bottom, every which way, because in a way, this is the starting point right there. And what do we have at the center? Not just imagery, but text, right? And what is the text? Shema Yisrael, Hear O Israel, the centerpiece of the most central statement within the Jewish tradition, surrounded by flame, surrounded by a kind of wreath, a circle of completion and perfection, an idea that goes all the way back to pagan antiquity with respect to that idea. That's the centerpiece of this construction of, as I said, about 29 scenes that take us through biblical moments and diaspora moments. So, for example, Moses and Sinai are represented by the Ten Commandments as they are traditionally depicted, a pair of stones on which the beginnings of the Hebrew phrases all appear. As a matter of fact, here is the Sabbath Commandment, the beginning of it. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. And if we move kind of chronologically forward within the biblical context, we have a whole series of different prophetic figures. So we come, for example, to Isaiah, and we see this wonderful high relief depiction of the prophet. And peacefully, you see the lion and the lamb, all these animals. It's a vision of a messianic future with its peace, by contrast to this dramatic bemoaning figure of Jeremiah, whose hands are raised to the heavens as he bemoans the destruction of the first temple in Jerusalem, as he bemoaned the anticipation of that destruction, railing against the Judeans for not living up effectively to the covenant. And on the third hand, the prophet Ezekiel, whose vision in chapter 37 famously is of a future when the righteous dead will be raised from the dead, from the earth. Their bones will be reclothed in flesh. And this is both a reference to that vision, and of course, it's also intended to be a statement about Israel, the state of Israel, as a form of reclothing the flesh of the dead, those centuries of diaspora Jews dispersed and oppressed, persecuted. The culmination, of course, is the Holocaust, being, as it were, reborn in this secular messianic reality of Israel. And in the course of the diaspora, all kinds of moments and issues. This is, in fact, Ezra. So this is the very first, you might say, diaspora. After the return from the Babylonian exile, after the destruction of the first temple, the beginning of the second temple, Ezra is the one credited. The traditional date is 444 BCE, with redacting, with editing in its definitive form the entirety of the Torah, the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, Genesis through Deuteronomy. That's what we see going on here. Or by contrast, within the second pre-Christian century, a story that has become so popular in the Jewish tradition, even though it's not within the Hebrew Bible. It's the story of the Maccabees. That's whom we're seeing here, struggling for independence against the Seleucids, and seen by him again, in a sense, as an anticipation of the struggle to create a state that will come about in 47, 8, 9. Or an image here of folk out in the diaspora raising their hands to the heavens, begging for the messianic future and the rebuilding of the state, hoping for it to come about as soon as possible, the yearning for Eretz Yisrael, and that yearning expressed in other ways as well. This is a scene that represents the golden age in terms of literature and culture of Jews in Spain in the 11th, 12th, 13th centuries. And of all the poets, the most renowned perhaps is Yehuda Halevi, whom we see here with books of his poetry, and his most famous poem speaks of Jerusalem as a harp to my songs, which would become an anthem, quite literally, many years after this, in a contemporary Israeli song by Naomi Shemer, Jerusalem of Gold, in 1967. And indeed, the culminating diasporic image, this is situated just above those words, Shema Yisrael, where we began, is the struggle during the Holocaust against the Nazis that is symbolized by the guns of the Warsaw Ghetto, the struggle in Warsaw, Poland, for the Jews to hold off the Nazi deportations and depredations for over a month in the late spring, the time of Passover. And just below the Shema, so toward the base of the Menorah stem, we have what in Hebrew is called ha'apalah. It's the return finally to Eretz Yisrael. You see the anchor, you see the ship, you see the muscular figure who represents those who are about to rebuild the state. And in the final image, right at ground level, we in fact see Eretz Yisrael in motion. So in the process of causing the desert to bloom, to rebuild the land, in a work that he took many, many years to research and ultimately to construct, that was ultimately delivered as a gift to the state of Israel to the Knesset from the United Kingdom as a gift in April of 1956 that marked the 8th anniversary of independence. And as I said, his intention was for it to be inside. It nonetheless ended up outside. This magnificent compendium, influenced in diverse ways by the idea of the menorah, by the influence of Rodin in his sculptural style, by the Ghibertian idea that a Christian mentioned of a kind of comic book array of images, in a typically Jewish artistic manner, combining image with text, and ultimately creating in its sevenness a leading up by way of all of these scenes to the evanescent candles that you might say connote the fire by night and the smoke by day, with which the Lord led the Israelites for 40 years through the wilderness, hovering over the tabernacle, and that fall between concrete and abstract in what smoke and fire are, leading ultimately upwards to that kind of redemptive heavenward pointing that marks the return to Eretz Israel that he triumphantly trumpeted in this magnificent work, which represents the culmination of his artistic efforts in the course of his life. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Ori. This is a very complex work, and the first question that right away comes to my mind is, do we know how free Elkan was in choosing the different scenes that are depicted on the menorah? Was he influenced by the people who commissioned him for the work, or by the people in Israel who were planning to erect the menorah? What is the background there?
Unless Christian or Wolfgang have other information, as far as I know, he was pretty much free to choose as he chose. And there's a certain degree of idiosyncrasy in the way he has juxtaposed them. There's no straight, simple chronology of images, down to up, up to down, but he does have a very interesting compositional series of parallels. So what's on the outermost candle, as it were, on the right, has a logical balance with what's on the left. And as you go in, there's that kind of balance. So there is a kind of, it's a very Greek concept, symmetria, or the Italians in the Renaissance called it contrapposto, a dynamic balance of imbalances, where instead of having the same thing left and right, you have different things, and yet they balance in a dynamic sort of manner. So he clearly has not only an interest in the scenes one by one, but in how he configured their relationship with each other. But as far as I know, it was out of his head and not anyone else's. And he spent many years doing research before he determined how he was going to do it. I don't know if either Christian or Wolfgang have other information. No, so we all agree on that. 3 for 1, 1 for 3, like the Three Musketeers, all for one and one for all.
I love that. So knowing that the menorah was done, realized before Elkan really seriously worked on the memorial for Dortmund, I'm wondering whether, how much the work on the menorah influenced the work on the memorial. For example, this scene above the Shema that you just showed, Ori, of the Warsaw ghetto rising, seems to me that it must have informed his memorial, which was not a memorial just for the Jewish victims of the Nazi era or the Second World War, but for all victims. So Wolfgang or Christian, what do you think?
I think it's meant in general, yes, for all victims, as in the memorial.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but I think you are right. there are self-citations in the memorial from works he did, you know, in earlier times, and of course from his work at the Menorah. That's I'm sure of. Yeah, it repeats itself sometimes.
Mhm.
I also get the feeling that one of the ways in which I'm agreeing with you, Rachel, that the Menorah served as a kind of source material for him was, you know, he's worked on all of these individual scenes, high relief, not as high relief, confined, but all of them crowded, and that clearly sparked something, because then what you showed, Wolfgang, of this work, which is just tumultuously overrun with figures, it's like it's the explosive outcome of what he might have had in seed form in his mind in the Menorah images or scenes.
Mhm. So do you, I mean, the war memorial for Dortmund was so different than all the other memorials that he created, where he depicted the, you know, the beautiful woman, the young woman, the mother figure who was suffering for the victims, or expressing her suffering for all the victims. So yes, the Holocaust was in between, and the experiences of that. So my question is, why is this memorial going to be built in Dortmund, or what's the story?
It's not the first time that I'm confronted with this question. And all I can say is you can see it in Dortmund twice even, no? in a large size, in a small size. And I wouldn't recommend, you know, printing it out of a 3D printer or somehow in another way. It's the brilliance of this idea is that you can see it, but it's not a material thing. It's an idea. And as we learned, we don't even know if he was finished at the time. It's a work in progress still when it was photographed, and it shows different steps in this progress. So I think that the fact that you can see it in Dortmund, and even at your home, as I told you, if you print out the QR marker, that's the real way he wanted, maybe wanted us to present it in 2021 with all the methods we have now with the idea science and all that. That's very modern, and I think that's the real way and the true way to show it this in 2021.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's almost as if it's a 21st century parallel to the late Michelangelo sculptures that are unfinished and are so eloquent.
Yeah.
You know, those slaves and the late, you know, deposition of Christ and so on. We don't know how he would have finally finished them, but there's something so eloquent about them. And in a certain different kind of parallel way, I see what you're saying about the eloquence of having these formulations without trying to actually do a copy of the real thing, when, as you said, he's not around to say, no, that's not what I meant. I was going to go
There was
this
no
way.
real thing, yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And but why wasn't it built? Was that, you know, I mean, I'm amazed that Benno Elkan really almost from the beginning of his artistic career seems to have been able to support himself, and pretty well support himself through commissions. That's a very rare story, artist story. And even with his flight out of Germany and his new start in London, he again right away had the the contacts to to solicit commissions, and that I find really surprising. And two things. I'm wondering whether it's because he and his father started all these clubs and were kind of made themselves part of a certain part of society that gave them entrances into society that helped him meet the right people for the commissions. And the other question is, if he was able to realize so many other projects, why not this memorial?
I guess he really, what you would call today, he was a networker.
Mm-hmm.
In the true sense of the word. He knew everybody in Frankfurt. He knew a lot of people in Dortmund. And, you know, he went to a boarding school, to a public school in Switzerland after he finished school in Dortmund. That's, in fact, where he got to know the British students who taught him how to play football or soccer. And I guess when he came to London in 1934, he still had contacts from this earlier time in the 1890s. Mm-hmm. And well, he was old and he was sick at that time in the late 50s, and his power had gone a little bit. His mind was still working, but and then of course, as I showed with the arguments of the Frankfurt Society, or 5 years, 10 years after the war, this was not a monument that could have been erected in Germany, any place, because it didn't reflect on the German guilt. It was too humanistic, it was too universal for a German city in 55 or even in 60. But nowadays, it's a different story, of course. Yeah.
Does that also have to do with the Allies?
No.
Because they were still around.
I don't think so. No, not at all. No.
But didn't you also say, Wolfgang, that his primary supporter also died?
Yeah.
And then his wife died, and of course then he
followed her within
and he's living in
months.
London. It's not even as if he's in Dortmund, where maybe if he's there in person, who knows?
Who knows? Who would have been a different story, but at that time it was too late.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, and I find the beginnings with the gravestones really interesting, that he goes from, and that he, this art form of the medallion, that he creates so many of these medallions that were Christian, can you talk a little bit about the function and why they were in fashion at that time? This is something that we don't really know anymore.
I think there's one reason he made it. He could live on the commissions. Mm-hmm. And the works were very important to get money and to get other commissions. That's a reason for artists to get mm-hmm. money. That's the work, I think. Yeah, but it seems to have been also an art form that was traded and kind of used as a presentation. And of course, I mean, I can imagine a medallion is for sure cheaper and definitely more mobile than a bust, right? Than a portrait bust. So,
it's also interesting, that there is a long association between Jewish craftsmen / artists and coin and medallion making in both the Christian and Muslim worlds, going all the way back to the medieval period. Mm-hmm. In part, I think, because certainly in the medieval period, having Jewish vintners and medallion makers was because the Muslims wanted to be as far away from making money as they could. Who's going to do it? Okay, we'll have the Jews do it. And I think to a certain extent in Christendom, although the Jews couldn't make their own ceremonial objects because of guild restrictions, again, when it came to money and medallions, it was something that, they can do, because there's something unsavory about coins, and therefore by extension medallions, because it's associated with the things we're not supposed to be associated with, taking interest, gambling, all those things that all three traditions don't like their practitioners to be involved in. unless it's with the other traditions, but not for themselves. You know, tax farming, the Jews get to do the tax farming. The Jews get to do the medallion making. Even the, you know, the American, the Lincoln penny, I'm blanking at the moment on his name, but it's a Jewish artist who was an immigrant from Eastern Europe, in fact, who designed the Lincoln penny. So it's kind of a weird coincidence, shall we say, that there is a long-standing Jewish role, particularly in medallion and coin making.
Right, right. Thank you so much. Christian, Wolfgang, do you have anything like that you still want to add, or otherwise I would, you know, wrap up and say goodbye.
Okay.
That's fine.
Okay. Thank you so much again, Christian Walda, Wolfgang Weick, and Ori Z Soltes for giving us a deep insight into Benno Elkan's life and art. In our follow-up email, you will receive a link to the recording of the event and a link to the virtual monument in Dortmund. And of course, I can't wait to travel to Dortmund and see it in
You're welcome.
in virtual reality. Thank you so much. We hope to see you soon again. Be well and stay in touch.